So let's just go ahead and get started. We've got a lot of content to unpack here, talking about Southwest Power Pool. Just look at the congestion, kind of updates on where we're at with the queue. I recognize that you guys had a panel earlier around queue reform, so hopefully I won't have to rehash some of that, but we'll go ahead and get started. Let's see. Okay, want to start with just a few slides, just kind of set the stage and update you all from the last Wind and Solar Conference. So this is a nice graph on the energy production for SPP as a region. One thing to note is coal moving up in 2021, kind of squeezing gas out. That's primarily driven by all the gas price craziness that's been happening in the last 12 months or so. But it's pretty much squeezed the gas out. Also to note, the wind continues to grow. So wind serving load continues to grow in the SPP region, which is a positive thing. Let's see. There's pros and cons to everything. I've mentioned in the past different generation attributes, and one thing that SPP, which really makes my role a little bit interesting and I think a little bit fun, is I'm not pro wind, I'm not pro coal. As SPP, we're fuel type agnostic. And so from an SPP perspective, we just look at all the different attributes. And of course, every fuel source has positive and negative attributes, pros and cons. One thing about wind is as much wind as SPP has as a region, there are times where, as you can see, 0.8% capacity factor on the left. So from a range perspective, sometimes across 14 states, there's just no wind to be seen. And so one of the things that we have to do is run resource adequacy studies to ensure that when that does happen, there's adequate resource fuel mix to be able to bounce back against that particular wind drops. So from a percentage serving load perspective, last conference last year, we talked about how wind actually for the first time was the number one fuel source in the region. And so that was the 2020 calendar year. And so you can see it's 31, but it was actually just slightly above the coal, 31.4% or something like that. And then in 2021, coal has exceeded wind again, but only slightly, and that's primarily because of the gas prices, as I mentioned. But also to note, wind continues to move up. So it moved up from the previous year's 31.5 to 35%. Okay. So it seems like every time we create these graphs, they're already out of date. Can anyone guess how much wind? So this wind shows 30 gigawatts installed. Can anyone guess where we're at today, just since I've created this slide? Anyone want to shout out what it is? 34. It's 31.7 registered or operational and 32.5 registered. So we're already, 2 gigawatts higher than this graph, and this graph was only made a couple of months ago. Thank you for guessing, though. We're heading there. We'll get there. Renewable penetration was the last record was last spring, so we haven't broke that record come this fall, but we'll have to see what's actually happening just in 2 days' time frame. So this is actually happening right now. As we speak. So I always like this, and it's kind of interesting in the Wind and Solar Conference that there's something unique happening every time that we discuss these things in real time and then forecasted. So it's kind of interesting because it's not a static chart. If you pull up spp.org website, you can actually see the wind profile, and we're projected to exceed our load in 2 days time frame. So the ramping and wind penetration levels, wind serving load levels are predicted to be pretty high. Now the key here is anytime you see those things, we don't necessarily get to that level, and there's primarily two reasons why. One is we have self-committed coal and gas resources, and we need those resources online because you can't just cycle them off when we hit these wind peaks and then expect them to come back on a few hours later. So operationally, we have to keep some of those resources online. And then another is from a rampable capacity perspective. Energy and ramp are our two key attributes we need in this continued fuel transition that we're seeing. We absolutely need energy and we absolutely need ramp. And so when we look at wind penetration levels and we look at wind records, we have to make sure that we have enough energy to back up the wind when it drops, and rampable capacity to ramp properly when the wind drops as well. It's very important. Okay, so again, this slide was already out of date. We're at 32.5 gigawatts registered in the market. Something that's interesting is just a back of the envelope calculation. Since 2014, we started our integrated marketplace at SPP. Year over year, on average, we've installed 2,800 megawatts of wind every single year for 8 straight years. So, we do have a queue, we do have a backlog, but we are constantly installing wind. And if you do the quick math around that, that's roughly 2 to 3 turbines every single day going live, being interconnected. So 2 to 3 turbines daily for 8 solid years. I think that's a pretty important soundbite to see, across 14 states, that this is happening, it's constantly happening, it's happening in the background. And we are working through the queue. We are working through to integrate more and more renewables. Let's see. Okay, so queue numbers. I'm not going to bore you with all these numbers, but I did mention that we're working through the queue. The queue has never really been, the GI interconnection queue was never really designed for a wholesale fuel mix change. That we're seeing. It was designed 20 years ago for incremental peakers. It was never designed for just swapping out coal and gas for wind and solar and batteries. And so that's part of the reason why we've had challenges really over the last decade. But it's our third reform in about 15 years, and this last reform has really shown a lot of benefits. So as you can see, this is all the generation that's been added in the last 18 months, whether it's through a new service, GIA, or an interim service, surplus service, various services that go through the GI process, as well as additional market registration. So it is working. It's just, takes some time to actually study these generators to make sure that they're reliable when they actually interconnect, and it's not a regret situation where you allow a generation to interconnect and then there's a lot of upgrades necessary, or maybe they don't output because they don't have deliverability through the transmission system. This is another way of looking at it for really just highlight the gold. The gold is the newer, latest reform. So in terms of how fast and how many iterations, it's a lot quicker. So the bottom x-axis is how many iterations it takes to get through an actual GIQ. So we're pretty positive on this last reform and just making sure that we're continuing to improve. But this is actually showing, again, it's limited data points because it's only been about a year. But from every instance that we can see, it's actually working this time. And that's another aspect of it. So the quarter 3, 2022, how are we doing? We're getting more completed, we're more progress, and then less has not started. So over just a few quarters, we're actually starting to see us get through the backlog, get through and allow for more interconnection. So this is always the obligatory what's in the queue slide. This is latest and greatest as of just a couple of weeks ago. 95 gigawatts, 95.6. So in the batteries, that's all lithium ion, it's all 4-hour, it's all the same type of technology that we have. It doesn't necessarily need to be that, but that's what it is today. And they're fairly large projects. I mean, there's 50 megawatts in there, 100 megawatt battery storage facilities in those 113 requests. The hybrid is kind of a mix. It's a hybrid, I guess. It's a mix of solar and batteries, batteries and wind, and we actually have a trifecta in there where it's wind, solar, and battery all at the same interconnection site. And then solar, standalone solar. So one thing to note is this year is the first year that solar has exceeded wind in the queue. So we definitely see that solar is the next new frontier for us. And, again, just like wind, and you could say gas and coal, it's an asset and it's a liability. And so from an operation perspective and incorporating these newer technologies, we see solar as very complementary to wind until it's not. And so we need to make sure that we're constantly looking at what's the appropriate mix when we continue to interconnect more solar. This is just a good map. This is on the website and it's in more real time, so it's not, this is a little bit out of date, but it at least illustrates just the vast regional dispersity of the queue. So it's kind of all over the place for SPP's footprint. This one, so a lot of questions come up on, so what's actually going to be built out of the queue? And that's very difficult for SPP to answer, but we do try to use a lot of data points on what actually goes through the queue, when did they get pulled out throughout the queue process, when did they actually get built. We have a number of developers that actually have a GIA in hand, and we haven't actually seen them go commercial. And there's supply chain issues, there's all sorts of issues why. And so that's why it's very difficult for SPP as the RTO to kind of answer that question. But we try to put like a benchmark in our forecast, because it does drive certain assumptions on our forward studies. And so that's what this is taking maybe 40% of the study queue, and that is our latest data point on what actually gets built. It used to be less than that. So we're actually seeing a greater percentage of what actually gets through the queue actually gets built. And there's probably some very reasonable reasons for that, because we've increased financial securities throughout the GI process. And so the seriousness of some of the developers in certain projects, actually, by the time they get through the queue, they're probably going to get built. So this kind of shows you. Now, one thing else to note is the sheer volume of what's actually being done. So when you look at what is projected to be cumulative generation and active study, and then GI plus, so kind of this red, let's see, I don't know if there's a laser pointer. Yeah. So this kind of red line. So out of that, that's a lot of generation when you talk about a regional a region that peaks at 50 gigawatts. So it's 53 gigawatts is our latest peak that we set in July. And so we're already seeing, this is just in the queue, a good portion of that. Okay, resource adequacy. This is a hot topic, and I can say, probably till all of us retire, our number one risk, at least at SPP, was and is cybersecurity. That's just probably the nature of the beast, and it's going to be that way for decades to come. But recently, our next, number one, our second highest risk corporately for SPP is now resource adequacy. And that's just fairly recent. It's definitely since the last time I spoke at the conference. And there's many reasons for that. We're still uncovering a lot of how we manage wind, how we manage solar, but there is capacity accreditation and the value to solar, wind, and batteries. But the entire industry, and in fact, the entire world, we've talked to the Philippines, we've talked to Iceland, we've talked to Germany and South Korea, and certainly MISO and PJM and ERCOT and all these others. We've talked to a lot of different people, and everyone is struggling with it. It doesn't matter who you are globally, everyone's struggling with what you accredit these renewables for, and it's all unique. So you can't just look at some other region and say that's what we need to do, because you got to look at your load profile, and you got to understand, when we actually have a certain load profile, when you actually have a low wind, low solar day, do you have enough gas or storage or coal or hydro or nuclear to be able to facilitate energy adequacy when you actually have those particular instances? And you can run, thousands of Monte Carlo simulations, but at the end of the day, it's real time. And if you're an operator or you're in charge of operations, you want to make sure that you actually have the fuel mix necessary to be reliable. And so there's the balance. And so what I like about this slide is on the right. It's kind of just a pretty basic sports analogy around baseball team. And if you're a coach, you can go out and recruit, and you can recruit triple the team, but that's probably silly, and it's probably a big waste of funds for the actual franchise that you're actually responsible for. And so there's this balance between hiring the right performance-based top tier talent and making sure that you have enough bench strength that is worth it. And so it's really a good, I think, a pretty decent analogy around, you're kind of selecting the right players for the team. And so energy adequacy is the players actually participating on the team in real time during the game. And then what we call the planning reserve margin is the amount of capacity you actually have on the bench. And so that's extremely important, because you can't build a generator overnight. As we talked about with the GI queue, and really pretty much what everything that's in the queue is renewable. So it's becoming a very important and critical topic for us to make sure that we're planning the planning reserve margin properly and making sure that the bench strength requirement that we have is set. And that is the bare minimum that we apply to all the load responsible entities in SPP's footprint. And from an SPP perspective, we recognize economics versus reliability. So we need to make sure that we're threading that needle to make sure that we're providing the right incentive and requirement for the region to be reliable, but we're not exorbitantly raising the planning reserve margin. I mean, again, there is accreditation mechanisms for battery storage, wind, and solar, and we need to make sure that we're balanced in that. But again, it's a really hot topic because no one exactly knows. So just like the 1 day in 10. So you've got, this is actually a standard criteria that the industry has been using for decades, and no one exactly knows. EPRI even went through this whole process to figure out where this 1 day in 10, and really it comes down to investment. It's just an investment risk. You're just running a bunch of simulations. You're trying to determine, hey, how much do I gold plate the system to be able to properly invest the system to be reliable? And so it's just like any other business. And so you just set that criteria. What we're finding now, though, is with variable energy resources, that's not enough. 1 day in 10 is not enough. And so we need to understand that when you actually have a load loss, how much expected load is actually lost. And so that's called expected unserved energy. And so we're developing additional criteria to be able to make sure that when we actually have a 1 day in 10 event, it's simulated, that we make sure that we're not losing a certain amount of load. I'm gonna go a little bit faster, but we just recently increased the planning reserve margin, primarily because operations is having a lot more issues. Instead of annual issues, it's more like monthly issues. Our system alerts are going up. One thing, and I kind of personally call it the death spiral, what's actually happening right now in this transition is as we're retiring more gas and coal, we're relying on the remaining gas and coal, right? That's intuitive. But during shoulder months like right now and this, fall and spring, we need maintenance. And so we need to allow these resources to actually maintain their integrity and process integrity to be able to perform in the winter and summer months. And so you're basically, every time we retire coal or gas, we're just limiting our ability to bounce back from wind and solar. And so what we're struggling with is not to say we couldn't replace that. We can definitely get to certain renewable goals in 2040 and 2050, but we need to make sure that we're not retiring at such an accelerated rate that we no longer have gas or coal to be able to bounce against when we don't have, I guess, the amount of installed wind and solar to be reliable. So that's very important. I'm going to skip to transmission planning. So fast forward to transmission planning, we have a pretty robust process, but we're actually improving it. So we try to blend reliability, economics, public policy, and what we call persistent operational issues. And so we try to look at all of these things because traditional planning, just a traditional power flow engineer or power systems engineer, is just reliability based. You just run the models, you increase your load profile, you see if this transformer blows up, and you try to figure out how to replace it or upgrade or give it another path, or there's various ways. What we try to do is blend multiple goals. And so from an economics perspective, it gets quite interesting. Because what you try to do is predict the future, and you try to predict where these economic concerns and congestion actually happens. It takes anywhere from 4 to 10 years to build a transmission facility, and it takes about 2 years to study it. So it takes a long time to actually study transmission needs and then facilitate the cost allocation process, issue the notice to construct, actually build, there's right-of-way issue, everything that goes along with transmission build before it actually gets built. So we have to get better at forecasting the needs of the transmission system so that we can actually drive the transmission build in lockstep with what's actually happening with the generation and load changes. Projected retirements, I kind of mentioned the death spiral associated with this. We need to make sure that we're facilitating from an SPP perspective. Again, we facilitate retirements. If a utility wants to retire, we facilitate that. But we want to make sure that we're not reducing the amount of primary frequency response that's on the system inertia, voltage response, basically all the nuances that generation brings, because generation doesn't just bring energy. it also brings all these other attributes, and we want to make sure that when we're retiring a gas or a coal plant, we're replacing it in kind with the appropriate attributes. Okay, real quick quiz. Given what's in the queue and what I've talked about so far, can anyone tell me what's wrong with this graph? I'll give you a hint because we're running out of time. It's right around in the right side of this screen. So what this is to the left of each dotted line is actuals. So that's irrefutable. That's SCADA. We measured that in real time. On the right is our forecast. So obviously that could be very wrong. What do you think's wrong with the graph on the right? The blue or red? What do y'all think is wrong? There you go. There you go. So for all those that didn't hear, we're not building that much gas. So that's a constant feedback from our members, because you see in the queue, that's not what's in the queue. There's 4 gigs in the queue out of 95 gigawatts of So one of the things we're trying to do is incorporate integrated resource plans. We constantly, in these futures for building out transmission, we're constantly working with members. So it's not just SPP staff doing this. We get feedback from the members. And so that's one of the constant feedbacks that we're trying to fold in. Is how much gas or controllable resources are actually going to be built to be able to offset or augment reliable operations. This is okay. Okay, one thing real quick. So we're doing a 20-year assessment, and it's the study year 2042. And so something to kind of note, and I just highlight, I know this is a busy slide, but just the amount. So we don't actually have but 2.2 megawatts. 200 megawatts. So 0.2 gigawatts of solar. And you can kind of see the solar projections 20 years out. And then wind, we are currently at 32 and a half that's registered. And you can see the projections. And this is our 20-year assessment. We do not build transmission out of this study, but we do it every 5 years, and it helps drive and inform transmission planners. So we do solve the system, we look at the needs, and then we actually build solutions. We just don't issue NTC, so no transmission actually gets built. But this one in particular is coming out next April, and I'm pretty excited to see the results of it, because it'll help kind of navigate based on bookends where we need to be building the transmission system. And I think it'll be very informative to a number of you as well. This is another thing from an economic perspective. So when we talk about congestion, we try to predict congestion. And then when we build out the portfolio, what this is an average locational marginal pricing chart. And so what it does is it tries to say before we build out the transmission system and after we build out the transmission system, it kind of levelizes the LMP. So this is kind of a clear color-coded indication of the overall benefit to the region when we build transmission. Now, this was one portfolio. But you can kind of see where the transmission was built just based on the coloring, like up in North Dakota, there's some transmission facilities that were built out of that. All right, want to save some time for questions, but I do want to cover this real quick. I mentioned ITP. Our integrated transmission planning process is fairly robust, but it can be better. And this is a pretty good illustration of why. We have all these different business functions like AQ for low delivery point additions. So membership might come to us and say, OPBD might have an additional load that they want to interconnect. Same thing with GI. So you have the generation interconnection process. What we're trying to do with the consolidated planning process is it's kind of like ITP 2.0. It's basically taking all of those things that we're doing in ITP and then also incorporating the GI process, the AQ process, transmission service, and we're trying to integrate all of those into one plan. And so it's easier said than done, but we do have an active task force that we're working with membership on to be able to blend it together, and basically it'll be feeding into, because it's ultimately one grid, right? It's multiple business functions and reasons why we have these things going on, but we're pretty excited by that effort. Another thing that we're doing to address congestion, and this is pretty novel, you guys have probably heard of the DOE National Grid, Build a Better Grid Initiative. I know you guys I think the Inflation Reduction Act was discussed earlier this morning. And so one thing that we're doing, and we're actually working with DOE on this, is SPP and MISO, so our neighbor, we have over 280 tie lines with MISO. all along the seam, all the way from Canada down into Louisiana and Texas. And so we've yet to build a transmission facility, an interregional project with MISO. So that could be like a negative press kind of thing. You know, SPP and MISO never built anything. But you could also look at it from a glass half full perspective and recognize that, you know, during the winter weather event, the Winter Storm Uri, we imported over 5 gigawatts through those 280 tie lines. So it's already a fairly robust seam in terms of transfer capability. However, there is a lot of wind and solar that wants to be built, obviously in our queue, but also MISO's queue. And so what we did 2 years ago, about a year and a half ago, we got together, SPP staff and MISO staff got together and said, look, we need to do something about this. So we developed this joint targeted queue study. And so this JTIQ brings together all those assumptions in MISO's region and SPP's region and develops a transmission portfolio. And this is the transmission portfolio we developed. Now, from a tariff perspective and cost allocation perspective, we're actively working on novel cost allocation to actually get these particular projects funded. And that includes the developers themselves being a part of the solution. So it's not just SPP load paying, MISO's load paying, but it's also those in the queue that were part of this study in SPP and MISO. So there's kind of like four layers of participants that actually will be funding these particular projects. Right now, that's what's being active. So we've already gone through the engineering side of things. Now it's more in the cost allocation realm and working with SPP's stakeholders and MISO stakeholders for the appropriate cost allocation for these. But from a congestion perspective in this particular conference topic, this is something that's novel. We're working with the DOE to see if some of those funds associated with the Build a Better Grid, because this directly aligns with the goals of the DOE. And so, and they love it. They want to figure out how to fund it. But again, you kind of put your DOE hat on. If you work for DOE, you want to make sure you're running the traps and allocating federal funds appropriately. And so we're kind of working with them on that. But that could be a fifth I guess, layer to offset the costs of all these projects and basically say, hey, look, this is an example of how DOE and the federal government could actually help build out interregional projects working with multiple RTOs. So we're pretty excited about that. Okay, right before questions, we couldn't pull up the real-time map, but this just happened last Thursday. So wind is pretty exciting right now. This kind of gives you an illustration. So this is the real-time balancing market. You've got your wind, and then the red is lost wind. Well, that's not an error in forecast. That's actually what I mentioned earlier. It's around self-scheduled coal and gas and making sure that we have enough conventionals online when the wind drops, which it did. But this is a different, and we just developed this map, so you guys are getting a first look at this. We just developed it last week, and it's a different way of looking at it. So instead of looking at the wind, you're looking at the traditional capacity. So you're looking at coal and gas, and you're actually seeing what's happening when wind maxes out. So when wind maxes out in the footprint, you can see the orange, which is the dispatch megawatts, go down to what we call eco-min. So it's basically stability min for thermal generation. And so as you can see, the wind is saturating to the point where we've ramped everything else down as fast as possible. It's also impressive to see how fast the conventionals dropped to allow for the wind to actually happen. And then they have to pick back up when the wind drops. So we have to make sure that we constantly have this operational range when the wind fluctuates throughout the region. It's very important, it's very critical, and when you look at the SPP.org website, you can see the 7-day out wind forecast, and right now it's pretty interesting. You can see how we're predicting to go above our load, and we'll have to make sure we have engineers and operators that are constantly looking to make sure we have operational range and dispatchable resources. We're not concerned about clock minute loss. We're concerned about kind of a slower ramp or a slow burn. But I can say that this last week, we far exceeded our 1 hour ramp. We ramped generation 6,600 megawatts in 1 hour. That is a massive amount. That's like 5 nuclear facilities in 1 hour ramping to be able to accommodate that wind. So it's pretty impressive on both the up and and down range. And it's very important, from a regional disperse, you can't just use one resource to do that. You have to use multiple gas and coal to kind of bounce against that wind. But it did it reliably. Do y'all have any questions?
Do you have a rough estimated timeline for completion of the joint projects with MISO?
So we're still working on the cost allocation, but yeah, the timeline is next year. So we expect to have cost allocation policy. I'm not sure if it'd be April would be our round of meetings that we would be targeting, but that seems reasonable we have quarterly round of meetings, and so we have to make sure that our members are comfortable with the cost allocation process that's being proposed. So the question is, how long do we think that the projects would take to be energized? So it's roughly 4 to 6 years, given that these are, so in our cost estimate window and our time to build assumptions, pretty much all 345 is just a straight 4-year. And it can be built a little faster than that, but our experience is roughly 4 to 6 years.
I agree that the 6,600 megawatt ramp is impressive. Are you considering a ramp product?
Yes, we actually have a ramp product. We have a ramp product and we have an uncertainty product. In my opinion, it's debatable on whether or not that's enough to incentivize the proper generation to stick around. So we may be compensating them for, gas, basically. At least that's what we have right now. So if you just assume that that's what we're using, we've provided the need and the demand curve in our market product to be able to incentivize and pay them for the ramp that they're bringing. But marginal pricing in real time, in my opinion, is not enough to keep an entire power plant around. So we need to do something more in that space, and it does get into a lot of conversation around resource adequacy or energy adequacy. At this time, states, SPP, and members are not exactly in favor of some kind of capacity market, which that's not exactly what we're talking about. I think our market monitoring unit calls it an availability market. But something needs to be done to where we're sending the proper signal to and not just gas, it could be renewable type of generation. Storage is one of them, but maybe a longer term storage that can come and actually be compensated appropriately for that particular attribute, because it's extremely important.
And what about ramp down?
Ramp down is the same way.
The Department of Energy did some studies not too long ago looking at inter-regional transmission, like looking at big direct current lines across the east grid to the west grid, and I think it was Department of Energy, somebody, and concluded that they could really reduce the amount of storage and things like that we would need if we could build that capacity to transmit large amounts of electricity from the eastern grid to the western grid. Do you have any thoughts on that, how that, whether that makes sense, how that fits in with SPP?
Yes, I do. That's a loaded question. So we've participated in some of those HVDC macro overlays. I think they're good from an academic perspective, but there's a number of problems with it. One is you have to have an underlying transmission, just like distribution and EV and everything. I mean, you have to have a strength behind those large HVDC. You also have to carry, that's something that's usually missing out of all those reports. You have to carry enough generation. If you're exporting 4 gigs to Atlanta and then all of a sudden one of those HVDC lines trip, what do you think Atlanta needs to have on hand immediately? They have to have 4 gigs of generation that has to show up immediately. So I think there needs to be a lot more work to be done when it comes to that. My personal preference is we have existing tariff, we have existing cost allocation rules. SPP is expanding, which we'll talk about after the break, but we're expanding to the west. We've even done some feasibility studies about joining the interconnects. And so it's like, if you build the grid out incrementally, we built $12 billion worth of transmission. Again, we're building 2,800 megawatts of wind each year. People can say things are slow. In my opinion, they're just at the right pace, because we're constantly learning every single day we're learning, building operational tools, building policies, building procedures. And so the HVDC overlay is really nice, but who's going to build it and who's going to back the infrastructure behind it? I think that what would be better is something like the JTIQ and just kind of incrementally look at what's actually being built and get buy-in from the load so that the load, I mean, they're ultimately going to pay, whether it's through our own taxes or through your rate base. And so I just think that there's probably too much emphasis on the overlay aspects of it. I think that more regional, interregional projects need to be focused at the local and regional level. 5 more minutes. This is the first time I've ended early.
Thank you, Casey.